Well, good afternoon. Today we're looking at Psalm chapter 43. It's a very short psalm, and so let's go ahead and just get into it today. Psalm chapter 43, David says to God, if it's David speaking here, judge me, and the idea here is to vindicate him. Uh, the psalmist is being falsely accused of things he's not guilty of. That is, they're saying he's done something and he didn't do it. And so they're misrepresenting him and they're lying about him and slandering him. And if you've ever been falsely accused, you know how difficult and how painful that experience is. Notice again, too, as we look at this verse, when he's asking God to vindicate him or to contend with him or his enemies, that he's asking God to take action. That's why you see in the latter part of the verse, oh, deliver me from deceitful and unjust men. In verse number 2, notice this, for God, thou art God of my strength. That's an important phrase, isn't it? I mean, we need to ask the question sometimes, is God really my strength or my stronghold? He's my fortress, my rock. And that's one of the amazing things about the psalmist so oftentimes is he looks at God as his strength and not other things what other people sometimes think like money or power or position. But he looks in life as God has his strength. Oh, that's really an important concept, and we ought to dwell on that or ponder on that ourselves. And so he goes on to say, and he asked this question three times. I suppose that we ask it many, many times. If you notice in verse 2, he'll say, why hast thou cast me off? Why do I go mourning? Because of the oppression of my enemy. And he'll say that pretty much the same thing in verse number 5. Now, I want you to consider this for just a moment. We're not talking about a person that just cries out in panic to God and bombard heaven with why, but here is a man whose God is his strength. We're talking about a man who has faith and confidence in God, and so he's asking, why is it that this trouble seems to continue and you haven't acted? I think it's important, especially for people who believe in God, who people are followers of God, that they consider what the writer's saying here, because there's things that happen in our life that we just don't have an answer for. Maybe that day will come, but what we have to do is not trust in our own understanding, but trust in the Lord. In verse number 3 is an important verse that I want you to pause for just a moment. I want to stop there. If you look in verse 3, oh, send out the light and truth, let them lead me. Now, of course, if you're in a dark place, you need some light. And the only way you can find your way out of darkness sometimes is to have light. But there's another consideration here, I think, is that because light exposes falsehood, it exposes ungodliness. And because it does, people don't like it. But maybe the writer is saying to God, put a light on this thing, expose their falsehood, expose the lies, and let truth, you see, surface. And sometimes, you see, that's what it takes for things to be exposed. And so he may be thinking about God vindicating him and God exposing their evil ways, and that the truth comes out. Sooner or later, it often does, doesn't it? Now, let me go ahead and read further. Oh, send out the light and thy truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me unto thy holy hill and to thy tabernacle. And I want to read verse 4, and I want to pause there for just a moment too. Then will I go to the altar of God, unto God my exceeding joy. Yea, upon the harp I will praise thee, O God my God. Now let's think about this for just a moment. David, if it's David speaking here, is asking God to deliver him and expose the falsehood and the slander of what they're saying, that he's innocent, and he wants God to act on his behalf. And then he believes that God will deliver him, and when he delivers him, he says he's going to go to the tabernacle for the express purpose to worship and praise God. Now let me ask you something. It's my conjecture that most people miss worship because they don't think it's a big deal. Do you? I mean, I think that a lot of people, when you get right down to it and you expose and the light shines on their heart, that oftentimes the reason they don't come to worship God is because they don't think it's a big deal. Worship is a big deal. And I like to open that up sometime and talk about why worship is a big deal. I know sometimes you can go in life and miss a lot of things because you didn't think it was a big deal at all. You don't think missing church is a big deal. You don't think that leaving God out of your life is a big deal. We make some dumb decisions because we didn't realize it was a big deal and we made a big mistake. We just know that's how it goes. And so it's interesting, I think, because you see, the thing here is out of gratitude that God has delivered him, and he'll go to worship praising and with joy. And that element has to be there. The more gratitude we have for God, you can be certain we're not going to miss worship. And that's what we got to think about sometimes when we come together to worship. Even when we take the Lord's Supper, sometimes it fails to do its purpose if we fail to remember the purpose for the Lord's Supper is. Remembering what God has done. You see, it's a big deal. And remembering how Jesus died on the cross that you might live, that's a big deal. And so we're suggesting in this verse that the writer here knows that it's a big deal. In fact, if you go back to the previous chapter, he's speaking of the very same thing about coming to worship and longing to be in worship and to praise God. You see, isn't it interesting? Isn't it just interesting if that's really in our hearts, that it's a big deal to miss church and it's a big deal to worship? And so this psalm is a great prayer because he's praying to God, isn't he? When you get me out of this mess, I'm going to praise you. And by the way, we could read more of the Psalms. Even when you're in the mess, you praise God. It's an important thing that we get a handle on what worship truly is and what our motive and intent for worship is. And so this is an important psalm. I hope it's helped you today, because we want to further down the road talk really about what worship is truly all about. And so we'll continue our study tonight. I hope you'll be with us at 7 o'clock. We're going to be looking at Psalm chapter 44. That gives you a chance, doesn't it, to look into that great psalm, and we'll talk a little bit about it tonight. So, have a good day, and we'll be going further in our study, this great study in the book of Psalms.